right, so let's continue our discussion of schizophrenia. So, as of the DSM IV, you have to report at least two or more symptoms of the following within a period of a month. And these need to be present for a large portion of that month. And we'll spend some more time talking about what a good chunk of these actually mean. So you have to present with two or more of the following: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, greatly disorganized behavior, and I'm not necessarily talking about like clutter or being messy. Rather, disorganized thought processes, um, jumping from thought to thought in a very, very nonsensical sort of way, apathy, lack of initiation, and social withdrawal. Now, these criteria were not refined until about the 1970s or so. A lot of the times, these were previously diagnosed as other types of mental illnesses. Now, in the DSM 4, there were different types of subtypes of schizophrenia. So, for example, it was not that common to hear about a paranoid schizophrenic or a catatonic schizophrenic or a disorganized schizophrenic. So, paranoid schizophrenics didn't really have the disorganized speech or the disorganized thoughts. They really only had the delusions or the hallucinations. Disorganized schizophrenics didn't really have delusions. The catatonic schizophrenics were more apathy, lack of initiation, and social withdrawal. Well, as of the DSM 5, there are no more discussion of these different subtypes. So the different subtypes, paranoid, disorganized, catatonic, undifferentiated, or residual, have basically been removed from the DSM 5. And I believe that the reason for this is that generally, somewhat similar to what we've seen with something like autism spectrum disorder, despite the fact that people with schizophrenia in these different subtypes do look a little bit different, there are probably some commonalities that all of different subtypes share. So this is part of the reason why I think they did that. Let's spend a little more time talking about these symptoms. So when we talk about the symptoms of schizophrenia, we tend to group them into three different types. We have what are called negative symptoms, positive symptoms, and cognitive symptoms. So negative means that something that we expect is suddenly absent. So negative here implies lack. So with negative symptoms, we will see things like flat affect. So you can kind of hear me talking right now. I have a lot of inflection in my voice. I have a very natural rising and falling in my voice. Uh, you can also hear the emotion in my voice. Now, somebody with flat affect is not going to really do that, even if they're in a good mood. Their affect is always going to sound like this, regardless of whether they're in a happy mood or a sad mood. There won't really be a lot of emotion in their voice. And so this is something that we expect, but it's unexpectedly absent here, which is why we call it a negative symptom. Likewise, lack of initiative or lack of will is considered a negative symptom. So positive symptoms, those are cases where something is unexpectedly present that shouldn't be. So that will include things like hallucinations. Um, hallucinations, typically with schizophrenia, they will experience auditory hallucinations. There are delusions. So that can include things like delusions of grandeur, believing that you have godlike powers or importance, delusions of persecution, believing that everyone's out to get you, that people in the television are watching you and keeping track of you, and then delusions of control, that you're basically being controlled by other people or that other people want to control you. In addition, we can also have disorganized thinking. This is cases where people are basically jumping from one topic to another, It can appear very nonsensical. They might string together nonsensical sentences. Generally, mania will also, especially if it's more severe, have some delusions or hallucinations, but they'll also experience a lot of energy and insomnia. And for people with schizophrenia, insomnia or high energy aren't really characteristic positive signs. So they do kind of differ in degree. Additionally, we do know that schizophrenia is associated with some cognitive difficulties as well. So we see impaired attentional abilities. Um, I've read some research about impaired working memory abilities, impaired problem solving, and impaired learning and memory. And we'll talk a little bit more about why this might potentially happen. So, just as a really quick comparison, because there are some similarities in the positive symptoms of schizophrenia and a manic episode in bipolar disorder, here are some clues to kind of help determine an initial diagnosis. So, generally, with people that are suffering, so the positive symptoms of schizophrenia actually can look like symptoms in about 50% of manic episodes, especially those with psychotic features like delusions of grandeur, hallucinations, or disorganized speech. The negative symptoms of schizophrenia can also closely resemble these symptoms of depressive episode, like apathy, emotional withdrawal, lack of affect, low energy, social isolation. So here's kind of the way that you can actually kind of tease them apart. So prior to the development of the mental disorder, we tend to find that people who develop bipolar disorder tend to be pretty social. People with schizophrenia tend to be more withdrawn. And I don't necessarily mean like an introvert. I mean severe social withdrawal. People with bipolar disorder tend to have a family history or a personal history of depression. People with schizophrenia do not. Bipolar, the onset tends to be pretty rapid. With schizophrenia, the onset tends to be a bit more insidious. It's more slow, it's more gradual, and that can make it harder to deal with. Family history. For bipolar, you're going to see a lot of family history of mood disorders. For schizophrenia, you're going to see a very, very strong genetic link and a family history of schizophrenia. So let's talk about some of the different biological factors that play a role in schizophrenia. So one of the first things is that one of the more interesting ideas is referred to as the neurodevelopmental hypothesis. This is basically the finding that there's a very complex interaction between genetics and difficulty during or after birth. So I kind of mentioned in the last lecture that genes generally do not express themselves. They don't really quote unquote turn on unless they're in the proper environment to do so. And the same is true here. Now, this complex interaction idea really stems from findings that suggest that for all of these things that are listed here, there's no causal link. None of these are enough to cause schizophrenia, but they're all very, very highly correlated. These are factors that increase probability. So that will include the following: natal nutrition, possibly a premature birth, low birth weight, complications during pregnancy and delivery. This can include things like preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy, interrupted blood flow or oxygen to the fetus during birth, spending too long in the birth canal, having the umbilical cord wrapped around the neck. Childhood head injuries also increase that risk. But probably one of the more interesting ideas is a spring birth. So if you are born, in particular, if you were born in around maybe partially around January, but largely March, April, and May, you're actually far more likely to be predisposed to schizophrenia than people born other months of the year. So So what you're looking at here are number of schizophrenic births per 10,000 live births. You can kind of see that we get this interesting little spike kind of around the winter months. You're more likely, and part of the reason that a spring birth seems to play a role in the development of schizophrenia, it's been theorized that it's because of exposure to viruses in the winter. You're first of all more likely to pick up a virus in the winter that actually kind of fits with our cold and flu season. And generally, spring births, basically with a spring birth, you are, if you're in utero, you are in the second trimester in the winter. Usually during the second trimester, that is a really critical period of development, including the brain. This actually came from a Scottish study, but the pattern is also observed in the Southern Hemisphere, obviously with the times reversed because our winter is their summer. So this would occur um, during what we would call our summer, their winter. Even more common, so one of the other things that we find that might actually predispose you to schizophrenia, more common than winter births, is if you grew up in an urban setting compared to a rural setting. And part of the reason for that is that if you're in a larger population, you have greater likelihood of picking up a virus. Viruses are more easily transmitted because there's more people. Research actually has taken blood samples of pregnant mothers whose children later developed schizophrenia, and they actually found that they contained higher levels of proteins produced by white blood cells, which indicates that the mothers were actually fighting an infection at the time. In addition to some of those neurodevelopmental issues, we do tend to find that people that develop schizophrenia do have some visible behavioral differences in childhood. Even though the onset is in the 20s, typically, signs are somewhat earlier. Generally, these children are reported to be less sociable. They engage in abnormal movements, such as either too much movement or far too rigid, maybe not moving their arms enough when they walk. They tend to have lower cognitive abilities and more negative emotions and more negative emotional expression. Now, if we look at schizophrenia and male and female typical ages of onset, so age of onset is here on our x-axis, percent of cases is on the y. For male schizophrenia, they're likely to develop it in adolescence. You can see that that's somewhat the case for women as well, even though it's kind of shifted over a little bit. Um, there's also a second peak for women, which we'll talk about in a minute. But generally, here's what's kind of important. This is in the late teens, early 20s, which is the same onset as bipolar disorder. So it's possible that's what's happening here is, again, possibly related to changes in hormones that typically occurs in adolescence and young adulthood. And again, kind of giving an idea that this might be due to sex hormones. Notice that the blip for female schizophrenia occurs in late 40s, early 50s, which is typically when menopause happens. So this could be something that is hormonally induced due to rapid rising and falling in sex hormones throughout life. Now, what does schizophrenia do to the brain? The brain changes a lot, especially in childhood and adolescence. So generally, once we are born, there's a large increase in synaptogenesis. A lot of different synapses are formed. But as our brains develop from experience and language and motor experience, some of the connections that we have, we kind of discover are irrelevant. So what will end up happening is that basically between 2 and 18 years, as you gain more experience, your brain's trying to figure out what connections it absolutely needs and which ones it can do without. And so it goes into a process of synaptic pruning, which is a normal part of development. Irrelevant synapses or connections are removed. Now, one of the things that's actually kind of interesting is that compared to healthy adults with no schizophrenia, we do actually find evidence of enhanced synaptic pruning in people with schizophrenia. So what you're looking at here is residual gray matter. So our schizophrenic patients are in orange, our comparison subjects without schizophrenia are in blue. So one of the first things that I want to really impress upon you, we've got age on our y-axis and we've got amount of gray matter in milliliters on our y. As you get older, you are going to lose gray matter, and that's true whether you have schizophrenia or not. Gray matter loss is normal throughout life, but notice that it's much, much more severe in those with schizophrenia. Notice too that this is not just during development, it occurs throughout life. Now, do notice that there is a lot of scatter here. Many other factors could contribute to this. It's possible compared to comparison subjects that perhaps patients with schizophrenia might have different lifestyles, different types of nutrition. Maybe they're doing drugs or different types of drugs from healthy patients. So this is, we don't want to oversimplify this. It's not specifically just schizophrenia. There are a lot of other factors that could cause greater gray matter loss. So here is kind of the rate of gray matter loss in normal adolescents and schizophrenic subjects. These were measured over 5 years, starting at age 13, when these schizophrenic subjects were first diagnosed. So they have what we call early onset schizophrenia. Now, pay attention here. So here on this axis, we've got annual average loss. As we get closer to green, yellow, red, and purple, we get more and more loss. And I want you to really kind of pay attention to areas in our schizophrenic subjects that are showing significant amounts of loss. So we see a lot of loss in the somatosensory cortex, the temporal lobes. We do have some areas of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as well as the occipital lobe. But here's what's interesting, despite that we see this gray matter loss, we don't know what triggers it. Could it be trauma, drugs, hormonal changes? It's possible that because this is a similar time period to endocrine development, there could be a factor, but ultimately, there's a lot we need to study with this. Now, here's something, again, kind of showing the kind of changes in the brain that you see with schizophrenia. So here we have the brains of two identical twins. They are discordant for schizophrenia, meaning that one twin has schizophrenia, the other one does not. So notice that our twin with schizophrenia, notice that the ventricles, which I'm kind of pointing to right here, are enlarged. And you'll also see that the brain is a little bit more shrunken, indicating atrophy. Now, because these twins share 100% the same genes, this atrophy cannot be simply genetic. Something else is going on here. So it's possible that there could be differences within the womb, different experiences during development. So again, genes aren't a pure predisposition. Genes are only going to work if an environment actually causes them to express themselves. So another hypothesis associated with schizophrenia is the dopamine hypothesis. And researchers have suggested that positive signs like hallucinations and delusion could be due to overactive dopamine. And so part of the reason that we think this is because a lot of dopamine antagonists like cocaine, amphetamines, crack, L-DOPA can produce psychosis, and the drug psychosis itself can look identical to psychosis that you'd see in schizophrenia. You'll see paranoia, hallucinations, or delusions. And additionally, dopamine antagonists like Risperidol do reduce psychosis. But it's a little bit more complicated than overactive dopamine leading to schizophrenia, as we're about to see. But right now, let's just focus on our positive signs of schizophrenia. So Lord knows you've seen this picture a lot this semester. So here we're looking at our different dopaminergic pathways. I'm really kind of wanting to highlight our mesolimbic pathway. So here we start in the ventral tegmental area of the midbrain, and we make contact with different parts of the limbic system, terminating in the nucleus accumbens. So there are different pathways of dopamine. They don't all respond or create the same behaviors. The dopaminergic pathway will mediate things like motivation, libido, eating, comfort seeking behavior. And it's, as we kind of talked about before, this is what we sometimes refer to as the addiction pathway because the mesolimbic pathway is also very, very responsive to drugs. And drugs with addictive potential basically hijack these circuits and produce abnormal levels of dopamine firing. But it's also believed to be overly active in schizophrenia, basically producing these positive signs. So the ventral tegmental area does have contact with the amygdala as well. So if the amygdala is associated with processing emotional information, especially if it's negative, overactivity could lead to negative affect and negative mood, like paranoia. And so, given the sensitivity of this circuit to addiction, it's possible that these behaviors, the paranoia, the hallucinations, the delusions, could be potentially reinforced by this circuit. So, here's some direct evidence actually linking dopamine and psychosis in schizophrenia. So what you're looking at here is basically controls and schizophrenics. They are based, if we infuse amphetamine, that actually stimulates the release of dopamine in subcortical areas. And so what we can see is that when we have that amphetamine infusion, here is dopamine release. Notice that even though there's a lot of spread here, generally the patients with schizophrenia are releasing far more dopamine. Now, why? We're not sure. Maybe they have more dopamine receptors, maybe they're more sensitive. And then here you can actually see that dopamine release here on the y-axis is positively correlated with psychosis. So here on the x-axis, we have change in positive symptoms. Higher numbers mean more severe positive symptoms. And so you can see that the more dopamine is released, the greater the likelihood that we're going to see that psychosis. Now, I mentioned that the dopamine hypothesis, the idea that people with schizophrenia have too much dopamine, is a bit more complicated than we think. And here's why. We have to think about what's going on in the mesocortical pathway. So the mesocortical pathway starts in the ventral tegmental area of the midbrain and then makes its final contact with prefrontal cortex. So in contrast to the mesolimbic pathway, it's been suggested that for people with schizophrenia, this pathway is underactive or hypoactive and can potentially be related to the negative and the cognitive signs. So you see things like apathy, social withdrawal, attention, working memory problems, lack of concentration. That sounds like something the frontal lobe might be involved in. Now, the question is this a hypoactive pathway? When people have infused dopamine antagonists into the frontal cortex of monkeys, so if you basically reduce the amount of dopamine circulating in the frontal lobe, you do actually get things like apathy, cognitive impairments, and working memory problems. And that suggests that reduced activity in this pathway is producing these negative signs and these cognitive problems. And in case you needed a little bit more evidence, we do actually see that in people with schizophrenia, when they are engaged in an attentionally demanding task, the frontal lobe is not really that active at all. They actually under recruit the frontal lobe during tasks that require it. So what they're doing here are different types of working memory tasks. And you can see that for persons without schizophrenia, you can see that we do get some recruitment of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. You don't see that in people with schizophrenia. So patients with damage to this area as well. So if we see people with dorsolateral prefrontal cortex damage, they tend to be really bad at attention tasks or working memory or concentration. And so it is kind of believed that for people with schizophrenia, there might be some damage to these areas as well. Developmental work has actually shown that this region in particular has quite a bit of atrophy in people that have schizophrenia. So this is going to be really important because it might explain why the frontal lobe is underactive and yet areas like the amygdala are overactive. So increased activity of the prefrontal cortex. So the more that the prefrontal cortex is active, the less dopamine release we get from the nucleus accumbens. Reducing the activity of the prefrontal cortex then will increase dopamine release from the nucleus accumbens. So let me say that one more time. So basically if I'm stimulating the prefrontal cortex, as you can kind of see here, that reduces dopamine release from the nucleus accumbens. If I inhibit the prefrontal cortex, that enhances dopamine release. The frontal and limbic areas are inversely related to each other. So this inverse relationship could explain why the first signs that we typically tend to see in people who develop schizophrenia are the negative signs and the cognitive signs. So if the prefrontal cortex shows atrophy during development, you get more synaptic pruning, more reduced activity. What's going to end up happening is because that frontal area is so inhibited, that could lead to the enhancement of limbic activity, like in the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala, and thus we then get those positive signs. So a hypoactive frontal cortex creating those negative and cognitive signs because of this relationship could lead to hyperactive limbic structures and the development of things like hallucinations or delusions. So let's briefly talk about hallucinations because they are by far one of the more fascinating aspects of schizophrenia. Generally, the hallucinations are auditory. They tend to be very poorly understood. Research has suggested this could be due to that volume loss that we see in the auditory cortex. As we kind of saw in those pictures, that temporal lobe activity and gray matter loss is pretty severe. And one other thing I will mention is that the reduction of activity in the frontal lobes could also explain this as well. The frontal lobe is really critical for a lot of your understanding of yourself and your self-awareness. So when I talk to myself, when I think about something in my head, it's almost like my frontal lobe can basically tag it and say, yeah, I said that. So it's basically engaging in self-observation and reporting conscious inner thoughts, desires, and sensations. If you don't have that frontal activity, it's entirely possible that you're not able to create that tag that says, I said that. So one of the more interesting ideas that I've heard about hallucinations in schizophrenia is that a lot of the hallucinations are people thinking to themselves, like most of us do all the time. But because of that reduced frontal activity, they can't basically tag the thought and say, that came from me. I made it. I generated it. Rather, they think it's disembodied and comes from somebody else. It's an interesting idea, and I think we need more research to figure out if that's what's happening here. How do we treat this? How do you actually treat a disorder that has hyperactive dopamine in the limbic system and hypoactive dopamine in the frontal lobe? So the first generation drugs were dopamine antagonists in the 1970s. So clearly, if we're trying to block dopamine, what we're trying to do here is basically get rid of those positive signs. Positive signs are associated with overactive dopamine. So a blockade with a dopamine antagonist will alleviate them. They're called antipsychotics. They do reduce the positive signs. They do nothing for those negative or cognitive signs. Um, so after one of the things you have to watch out for is tardive dyskinesia. So after a prolonged blockade of dopamine, they basically become hypersensitive to any type of dopamine stimulation at all. So when you're constantly blocking dopamine, once dopamine's actually in the system, your body's basically going to be oversensitive to it. And as the medication wears off, um, dyskinesia will result. These are repetitive, involuntary, purposeless movements, and they're potentially problematic because they can cause accidents, they can cause people to choke, and they actually do interfere with talking and eating. And we do actually see this in Parkinson's patients that are given dopamine treatments as well. So, obviously, we don't just want to fix the positive signs, we want to try to alleviate the negative signs and the cognitive signs as well. So, we started with antipsychotics. Now, in the 1990s, we actually have development of dopamine partial agonists, which are sometimes referred to as atypical antipsychotics, like Risperidol or Risperidol. Generally, they reduce all the signs, they reduce the positive, the negative, and the cognitive sides, and they will produce fewer side effects. So, how do these atypical antipsychotics work? So, here's what's interesting. These atypical antipsychotics, um, so they're basically partial agonists. So, they kind of resemble dopamine, but they're not a perfect match. So, your they have a high affinity for the dopamine receptor, but not as high as dopamine itself. Now, so here's where it gets kind of interesting. We're going to start with areas where there's high concentration of the neurotransmitter, like the mesolimbic pathway. Now, where there's lots of dopamine activity and high overall opening of ion channels, what happens when you introduce the partial agonist here in red is that it's going to bind to those receptors. And because it's binding to those receptors, that's one less receptor that dopamine can bind to. So here we can see a high amount of binding, but the partial agonist basically prevents the neurotransmitter from binding to these receptors quickly. So it actually lowers the opening of the ion channel and reduces activity by displacing them. Now, on the other hand, if we're looking like at our frontal circuits, areas where there's low concentration of dopamine binding, because the partial agonist binds with the receptors with a pretty good affinity, they can bind to these receptors and basically stimulate the opening of channels and raising that activity. So this is how it can actually both raise and lower dopamine activity. So what's the prognosis if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia? Although this work is very new, the prognosis is somewhat variable, and a big factor is whether or not you have a good support system and whether or not you're sticking to your medication. This is a huge factor. And we tend to find that about 70%, there will be a 70% success rate if you've got that support. If you have good familial relationships, if you've got supportive relationships, um, that can reduce stress. And we know that stress enhances the amygdala activity and can enhance those positive signs and trigger episodes. Um, Other things to kind of that can also affect prognosis is drug use. Drug use is relatively common. The reward circuit is affected, and a hypoactive frontal lobe is connected to a lot of addictive behaviors, and this can worsen symptoms. Therapy as well is also helpful. It can help patients recognize signs, seek help, and seek forms of treatment. This is still a work in progress, but we're pretty hopeful about it. And in a lot of ways, This is actually a lot less complicated than mood disorders, which can be incredibly multifaceted and can be due to a variety of different factors, or personality disorders, which are notoriously difficult to treat. All right, folks, so that is all I had. Thank you so much for joining me. You have everything that you need to help you prepare for your third exam. And if you have any questions on any of these materials, just let me know, and I will see you soon.